But still, yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Cleaned out the fridge. Because it would have been cold.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the College of the Sequoias. I'm Brent Calvin, thrilled to have you back for round 2 of our Ransacker series, and just so excited to have you here on our campus. I'm going to turn the mic over to our MC, Terry Oman, in just a moment, but I would just like to take a moment and thank our guests, Sergeant John Vaughn, for joining us again. Attorney and author, Mr. Tony Reed. And I'd like to thank Mr. Walter Deisler and Visalia Heritage for their support of tonight's event. Really should be fun. We're glad you're here to share it with us. And with that, let me introduce Mr. Visalia, Mr. Terry Oman.
Thank you, Brent. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. I too want to thank you for coming out tonight. You had other options for things to do on a Thursday night, and you chose us, and we appreciate that very much. But before I continue, I'd like to ask Walter Deisler, Vice President of Visalia Heritage, to come up and give us a few words.
Thank you, Terry. Tonight we're very honored to have our author Tony here to present his book, and at the same time we're very pleased to be able to use this facility thanks to Brent and his college. And Visalia Heritage is very pleased to be able to sponsor this event. And I'll just give you a brief summary of Visalia Heritage. We've been around for about 40 years. We're a nonprofit, and we're here to preserve our community. But the only way we can do that is if we engage our community. And part of the engagement is to have members, and we're really anxious to have membership in our group, because after all the things that we have been engaged in over the last 40 years, we're about to engage on our biggest goal ever, which is to build a museum in the city of Visalia. And we have been given some property, and we're very honored to have been offered this property to a very well-known Visalian, Mr. Stan Simpson. He and his wife purchased the property. It's very important that we gain membership so that we can reach out to the community, because we cannot do this without you as our supporters. So once again, thank you for coming tonight, and we look forward to you joining us in Visalia Heritage.
Thank you very much, Walt. This evening would not be possible without the staff and support of COS. They are amazing people to work with, and I really do appreciate the entire staff, including Brent and Lorene and the PIO for COS, plus the technical staff, and we appreciate them so much, and they're so accommodating to us when we ask for certain things. We thank them for that. But probably the most important folks we want to thank tonight are the two people seated in front of me, on my right, I should say. John Vaughn, who was introduced to you. John Vaughn was here on April the 6th. Some of you were here for that event. And John absolutely wowed the audience, and there were several hundred people here. And that's not to mention the number of people that viewed that particular program on the COS YouTube live channel. And so tonight, I also want to thank those that are viewing this on YouTube through the COS channel for watching it. And we thank you for that. And thanks again, John, for making the heated trip from the coast to the valley. John and Gail sacrificed tremendously to leave that 55-degree temperature in Morro Bay. So, oh, excuse me, I guess I shouldn't have said the town, right? It's okay? Okay, but too late now.
Fine.
Yeah. But actually, the most important person for this evening tonight is the gentleman on my far right. His name is Tony Reed. I didn't know Tony before April of this year, and I've come to know him fairly well, and I've known him now to be probably, in my mind, the most knowledgeable person about the Visalia ransacker, Golden State Killer, the D'Angelo character is what I'm talking about. This man is a walking encyclopedia. John told me that when I first talked to John about the April 6th program. He said, you really need to talk to Tony Reed. And I said, spell that for me. And I did, and I was absolutely amazed at his knowledge. And so we have the distinct pleasure tonight of having Tony give us a preview of what's inside his book called 122675. And you'll find out what that means a little bit later for those of you that may not know. But he's an attorney, he's a private investigator, and is so knowledgeable about this particular character that we're so lucky to have him here. The book that he just did has just been released, and I'm talking days now. I'm not talking weeks or months. It was released when? What was the release date?
July 1.
July 1, and here we are at July 7th. So you guys are the first live audience, am I correct on that?
That is correct.
To hear from Tony and to have an opportunity to get one of his books for your library. And you'll talk about the dedication a little bit?
I will.
Okay, I'll leave that for later. Give you a quick idea how the evening is going to work, just so you don't worry about whatever you're going to worry about. The format is going to be questions and answers. I'm going to ask a question. John and Tony are going to respond to those questions. And we're giving you a chance at the end to do a question thing of Tony or John. And each of you should have had by now a piece of paper with maybe a pen, where if you have a question that you'd like to pose, write it down, put your name on it if you'd like. We're going to collect them in the aisle, so if you raise your hand at some point when you have one, COS staff will pick them up from you, and then at the end, we'll try and answer a few of those questions. By the way, he told me at the last minute, those that he can't answer live, you're going to post them where?
I'll post them either on our Facebook page or on the blog, and you'll be able to read those questions and answers there.
Okay, thank you for that. That's a very personal service to be able to do that. So at about 7 o'clock, about 45 minutes from now, we're going to start wrapping things up, and we're going to adjourn the actual meeting here. You're going to go outside, you're going to get refreshments in the lobby, and then there's going to be 2 lines in the back outside the front doors. One line will be to purchase a book. Another line will be to have Tony sign it. And by the way, on my book, I had John sign a certain page there that you'll find out later. But anyway, you can get both signatures if you'd like. And that's going to be at the very end, and I'll adjourn you then. And then there'll be no more activities in the hall, in the lecture hall. So with that, I am going to pose the first question. Are you ready?
I have actually 2 quick housekeeping items.
Good.
The first is I have a copy of the book that I want to be here at College of Sequoias, and this is a special gift for the memory of Claude Snelling. You know, there would be a lot of other things that we could talk about, but I do want to take just a quick mention here of the very true and heroic story of Claude Snelling that has been glossed over by so much of the media and ignored. And I find that particularly troubling. I've looked at, you know, countless homicide cases. I've read thousands of pages of police reports, never in my life have I ever read a story half as heroic as the tale of Claude Snelling. The evening in question, the sacrifice that he made and his actions that night prevented his daughter from being abducted and killed. There is no question about that. His work and legacy here at the College of Sequoias affected many of the journalists who ended up reporting in the papers at the time and subsequently. His professionalism was never it was just unparalleled. He was a man of great caliber and stature and deserves so much more of our thought and attention. And as much as we can learn about Claude Snelling and his life and his sacrifices, we need to do that. We need to not let the media turn the light away from his life. So that's why I very much want that. I very much want that book to be here in the library, and thank you for accepting that. The other thing I want to mention is that the book is dedicated to John for the simple reason that when I sat down with John initially, that was after we shared some phone calls and we'd agreed that we were going to meet here in Visalia across the street at the Black Bear, where we had lunch today. And it was a nice reunion of sorts, but more importantly, John opened up his heart and his mind. He had been blanked by the Sacramento Sheriff's Office so fully that the idea of speaking to yet another person about the case was not exactly the first thought in his mind. The second thought on that refusal list would be to speak to someone who was a criminal defense investigator. And there have been so many people who had approached John about the story that I fear that he didn't want to be dragged out of retirement. I swear this is the last time. This is it. Any more times will be at your request and your request alone. The book is dedicated to John because he opened up his knowledge of the case. He cleared up to me the central point of confusion regarding the physical description and how the case got derailed after it left Visalia. But for his clarity, but for his exceptionally fantastic police work, that would have remained a mystery. And I don't think that at this point in time that we would be honoring Claude Snelling the way we are, hopefully, tonight and this point forward. So on that note, I do want to thank you once again, John. That's extremely important to include in our opening remarks. So thank you once again. My own opening remarks, I'll try to keep brief. Every wrongful conviction is different. When we look at the root causes, though, there are usually some strong similarities between the cases. And a great example of this is being reflected right now in an HBO documentary series that's airing every Monday night. And the title of it is Mind Over Murder. It's the story of 6 people who've now been exonerated for the murder of Helen Smith that took place in 1985. This all happened in a small town in Nebraska named Beatrice. And yes, they say it like that. I struggled with Visalia so many times. I kind of now feel some sympathy for the people of Beatrice for their legacy, but that's all true. In a recent interview, the filmmaker said something truly powerful that really captured my thoughts exactly on how to introduce this story, how I was feeling about this. And she was posed the question, how did you get involved? And the response to that was, I was so attracted to this story because it's not only a Beatrice story, it's an American story. It reflects so much of the current society and how people have strong opinions about one thing. They form a judgment, and they're unwilling to be challenged to reconsider. People who believe things that are the opposite, well, it's very hard to come together and have a conversation and reach an agreement. And the story is such an example, almost a distillation of that. It's exactly how I feel about this case. And I hope you'll understand why when you read it. I highly encourage you to watch this series. It's so remarkably well done. We're only halfway through right now, and there are 6 episodes, but on learning of the first episode, I immediately dug back into, as my nature would be, to go back through and find the source of how things went wrong in this case. I wanted to see for myself what had happened. And it turns out that the trouble started with one criminalist who was involved. It also turns out that this small town of Beatrice, their police department, had done some incredibly great work on the case. Within a month of the Helen Smith murder, they had correctly identified a plausible suspect. They made contact with the person, they got a warrant, they obtained his biological samples. Those were turned over to the criminalist, and she made a mistake when she ran the tests. She wrongly eliminated this person as a suspect. It turns out in her career, she made a lot of other mistakes. She ended up implicating more than 20 different criminal defendants using DNA and misstating the results to the courts. She put 20 people on death row, and one of them died as a result of her police work. This work has not, I'm not just saying this on my own, this work was identified by the FBI and by a state task force that examined her work. They found that her testimony was the sole basis for hundreds of wrongful convictions. My point is simple. It happens. I know full well the weight this case has on your community. December 26, 1975 weighs heavily on your county. I know full well that our implied trust in the justice system is imperative to the proper function of any community. I know full well that that system failed in the investigation, prosecution, and conviction of Oscar Clifton for the homicide of Donna Jo Richmond. I also know the same can be said about Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. And by that, I don't mean that DeAngelo is innocent, not at all. I do mean that the investigation as a whole, as it took place over 40 years, was a failure. The prosecution and the conviction of DeAngelo have closed the books. He doesn't have any appeals left. However, I personally have about 1,000 questions about that case, his actions, and what happened. And those questions are yet to be answered. That's the very best summary I can give you about what this book is about. Thank you.
Okay, other than Black Bear Diner, do you
Yes.
care to talk about how you two got hooked up together?
In 2015, I got the first batch of case files and was asked by the family to take a look at it. They knew that the case was beyond any criminal appeal process, as Oscar Clifton was deceased. You have to be alive in order to file an appeal. But the family had so many questions about the case. Why did this happen? How did this happen? Even though it had been through the hands of probably a dozen different attorneys, none of them had been able to answer the very basic questions about what happened and how it happened. And they heard about our firm and decided, you know, let's just ask. And so we agreed to take a look at things. We'd already taken a look at, in an unrelated case, we'd already taken a look at one of the cases we want to talk about tonight, and that's Jennifer Armour. Jennifer was a young girl who disappeared here in Visalia, November 15th, 1974. And having known that her homicide was still unsolved, it was misclassified for many years as just merely an accident, I went through those materials and I was looking to see, is there a possibility that there was a connection there? And one of the things that I was surprised by finding in the Clifton file was that there were references to the Visalia ransacker. And so I was curious to know how those connections came about. Were there any examinations then as to any possibility between the Armour case and the Richmond case? Why weren't they looked at together? Why wasn't the ransacker looked at as a suspect in the Richmond case? So I went through and then I got a hold of some of the Visalia Police Department reports. And I have to say that I was completely taken by John's approach to report writing. It was very different from a lot of things that I had written. You won't find his recapitulation of events in a lot of police reporting. But he did a fantastic job. And so I started matching together some of the timelines of things, the events, looking at possible Exeter connections, and again, looking at the connections back to Jennifer Armour. It took me several months to go through and complete the maps and the analysis and things, but when I did, I finally reached out to John, and I think that was about May of 2016. Started with a phone call, and then I said, hey, can I send you some more information? And reluctantly said yes. And then we had our first meeting, and why don't you tell them what happened?
I don't know how many times we've met, how many times we've talked, but it was a lot. And I think, I'll tell you right now, I think Joseph D'Angelo killed Jennifer Armour and Donna Richmond. I told Tony I never say obvious, but it's almost obvious. In all the hundreds of hours of investigative work that I was participating in, I was never contacted by the sheriff's office. No one ever asked me about Jennifer Armour or Donna Richmond, not one time. Jennifer Armour was last seen at Kmart on County Center, which was a high area of ransacked burglaries. And she was found murdered in Exeter on a ditch bank, close to where Donna Richmond was. So when Tony first got a hold of me, I didn't trust attorneys. I didn't trust attorneys too much. I can tell you a few stories about attorneys. Tony made me feel like he was sincerely interested in this information. I was retired. I wanted to find an end to this case. I wanted to know who the ransacker was. I knew the ransacker was in Sacramento. I mean, I begged those guys to listen to me, but no, they didn't want to. So I felt that Tony, and I really believe Tony is one of the best criminal investigators I've ever met. He leaves no stone unturned. And I think that's why Tony and I get along so good.
So John, both of those cases were Tulare County Sheriff's Department cases?
You know, we got together that night. We were actually talking about a particular suspect. I already had a person in mind, and we went through the Exeter connections in particular. And following that, you know, we talked about that day. We talked about how the ransacker got eliminated by Sacramento and what some of those problems were. And that came down in large part, we know now, to the hypnosis description following McGowan's hypnosis event. You know, we can point fingers here, there, and everywhere, but when everything is all said and done, that should never have been a way to eliminate Visalia the way that Sacramento eliminated Visalia. It wasn't proper evidence, and it was an absolute mistake then, and as much as it's a mistake now. But anyway, the other thing that John did that day is he arranged for a meeting for me with the current staff at Visalia PD, and you know, we had a long conversation following that there, and with them, I shared some of the maps and the evidence. We talked about the case, and as a matter of fact, they followed up on the person of interest that was identified at that point, contacted the individual out in Exeter, and so the Exeter connection, I just wanted to point this out clearly to everyone. Exeter connection was the basis of my investigation. That this is where I believed the evidence was the whole time.
Why was Jennifer Armour's case so important in this process?
So we're looking at here, the screen shows the basic outline of the Visalia ransacker cases. And as you can see, though that series of burglaries is a very tight cluster here in Visalia. There's a dividing line.
Tony, you're talking the red cluster?
Yes. Well, the red cluster is basically, what I did was I tried to orient them into various zones, and I used color to help divide so I could see that from a distance where each zone was. And you know, you look at that and you see that someone had, and in my mind, I approached John with this. I said someone had very strong operational knowledge of the cases. And the other thing to know is that John wasn't appointed to the Snelling homicide, wasn't appointed to the ransacker investigation until after the Snelling homicide. So when we're looking at that, we're looking at September of '75. So you can see there how much activity the Visalia ransacker was already involved with. One of the first things that John did to kind of understand the evidence was to go back through and to ask his team to pull together all of the reports they possibly could on the ransacker investigation. And after looking at them for a little while, they realized that the ransacker had really changed his operational awareness. In the first period, in '73, '74, he operated in the area that was primarily down here and over here. He had a little bit of activity in this zone here, but it was very concentrated in this zone down here. And as a result, John said to his team, because there was the shift and we need to focus on where he's operating now, we're going to draw a bright line in the investigation, January of 1975. And in retrospect, that makes perfect sense. When we look at the case as a whole, what we realize is that Jennifer Armour's disappearance is in November of '74. it was just outside the window, and I think that's another possible explanation for how that case got missed. When we were going through this, and the first day, I came to John and said, so tell me what you know about the Armour case, because this must have been investigated with Snelling. It had to be part of the Ransacker series. And I got a little bit of a confused look. We talked about that, but we also talked about the fact of the circumstances. After I introduced this, we talked a little bit more about who Jennifer Armour was and what the circumstances were of her abduction. And those were really important. Where she was last seen, where she was found, the fact that she didn't drive, she was transported there. She was 15 years old. She had no familiarity with this. She was found in an absolute isolated orange grove north of Exeter, approximately 2 miles away from where the Richmond scene is.
And Mount Whitney. Remember she was at Mount Whitney with the...
There's the other factor. That Jennifer Armour was a Mount Whitney student, same class as Beth Snelling. She was, on the evening she disappeared, she was walking from her home, which, we look back on the map again here, her home is down here. She was walking up this way towards the Kmart, and she made it almost, according to most of the reports, she made it almost all the way there, and that's where she was abducted. And we talked about the fact that there were a rash of the VR burglaries right around that zone, and those appeared to be connected at the same time with her disappearance. The fact that her disappearance is also 2 blocks away from where the Snelling home is made another important implication. But by far, the removal from Visalia, the transport to Exeter, was one of the biggest clues about what we thought was going on with that case. And as John said, you know, that this case was a Tulare County Sheriff's case. But even though she was abducted in Visalia, the way California law works, where the body is found controls who has jurisdiction over the investigation. So, you know, maybe talk a little bit about, you know, the fact about maybe why that line was drawn, or about why that part was left out of the...
Yeah, I guess I can do it now that we know who the suspect was. It's a lot easier. But I always felt that the ransacker moved according to our stakeout. We spent hours and nights working stakeouts to try to catch the guy, and he hit in a different quarter. I always thought it was quarters. Mooney Boulevard, nothing. Divisadero to Woodland, nothing. We thought there was too much traffic. But the other sides, from the freeway to Walnut Avenue, there was 4 quarters. And when we worked a quarter, he'd hit in a different quarter. So now I realized why he did that, because he knew where we were. I mean, he had police radio and probably had policemen talking to him. I'm sure he asked a lot of Visalia cops, you know, what's going on? I want to help. I'm sure he did that. So that's when we decided we're going to let him come to us. We're tired. We didn't tell anybody where we were. We staked out at that house where McGowan got in trouble. And that's how we caught him. I know most of you were here the first time, but remember I always said he didn't hit on Thursdays? And we never could figure that out. We even went to the bowling alley and watched league bowling because we thought he was a league bowler. And McGowan was here, and outside door, I was in the middle, and Shipley was at that end of the bar, watching all the left-handed bowlers. I mean, we were desperate. We were desperate. And Jennifer Armour, you know, I guess this case will never be solved now, but that's one of the first things I had asked Joseph D'Angelo, who would talk to me. And where's the gun that he shot Mr. Snelling with?
Yeah.
And I have one more thing I want to tell you. At the April 6th meeting, I forgot to tell you guys something. And I intended to tell you right after the break, when we came back together. But what I did was I looked at my notes and I forgot a couple things. So I went over those and I forgot to tell you this story. But I want to tell you about the last call I had in patrol. Remember, I was in detective for 7 years, promoted to sergeant, went back to patrol as a shift supervisor for 6 weeks. Then I was called back in for Snelling. Here's what happened. Dispatch. Sam 48 by sight. I said, go ahead. Dispatch. We have a report of a large group of outlaw bikers causing a disturbance at the Green Olive, Van Maddox, and Mineral King. 10-4, send 2 K-9 units, 2 patrol units, and I will respond. So we have 5 police cars going to the Green Olive. When I get there, there's about 40 Mongols in the parking lot who were attending a meet in Strathmore or something. And 38 of them got on their choppers, started them up, and left the parking lot eastbound on Mineral King toward Lover's Lane. I sent one of the K-9 units, Jay Frame and his Dobie, Trapper John, to follow the bikers out of town to make sure they didn't stop somewhere else. We had a problem with 2 guys. We had them both up against the patrol car, spread eagle, arm spread, leg spread. And Earl Grimes had a German Shepherd, who I love. I like dogs better than people, really. And I'll tell you, first of all, I was riding with Earl one night because I love the dog so much. And we got a call of a loud party in a residential area. We get into the area and there's cars bumper to bumper for 3 blocks in every direction. We pull up to the party and there's 100 kids out there. Music is blaring. Earl reaches down, turns on the revolving red lights on the patrol car. We light up the house. And he turns around and he says, bark. Bark. Tuffy puts his front legs and his shoulders and his head out the right side rear window and starts saliving, spitting, barking, growling, everything else. And the music went off. The kids got quiet. And we drove away, and we didn't get another call. Wednesday night, I'm riding with Earl, and it's raining. And he decides to leave Tuffy at home because the smell in the car is a little bad. We get a call of a burglary in progress. He runs, shoots down the alley in a police car with his lights off, and here comes the guy out from behind the store and starts running down the alley faster than we could run. And he gets up to this fence, he starts going over the fence, and Earl says, freeze or I'll turn the dog loose. And we walk down the alley and pick them up. So we're back here at the Green Olive, and Earl says, bark. And he's got a hold of the leash, big leather leash, and he's hanging on to Tuffy, and Tuffy's growling at these 2 guys. up against a police car, and they didn't move a half an inch. And then Earl says, takes the leash off and says, watch. Tuffy goes back, gets down on his belly on the parking lot with his feet out like this, starts staring at these two guys. Earl goes over and talks to the bartender to see if he wants to file a complaint. And of course, I was a sergeant, I'd have nothing to do. And I'm standing there watching Tuffy. All of a sudden, Tuffy looks over at Earl to see if he'd been looking, looks back at these guys, gets up, runs over, hikes his leg, and pees all over their the left leg of this guy and the right leg of this guy, and runs back, gets down in the watch position, goes like this, and he looks over to see if Earl caught him. And you know what was going through my mind? There's an equal opportunity employee, because he divided his urine evenly between those two guys. And then he looks up at me and goes, that's a true story. Okay, where were we?
I don't remember.
I always wanted to tell that story.
What were some of the details about the Visalia ransacker that were interesting to maybe both of you, because you both studied it so much? We can't hear you very well. Oh, sorry. I got lazy, I sat down. So let me repeat it. What were some of the details about the Visalia ransacker that were interesting to the two of you?
Yep.
Go ahead, Tony.
One of the things that caught my attention right away, having started looking at it from the case of Exeter and that viewpoint, were a couple of other details that were in the Visalia Police Department reports. There were 2 items that were ransacker loot that were discovered outside of Visalia. The first of those was reported as a handgun that was found down here. This is Avenue 256. And Ave 256 is a little bit interesting in this story, especially as it pertains to Exeter, because if you're operating here and you do not want to take the 198, you've got a couple of options. You've got Visalia Ave, or you've got 256. 264 doesn't go through. So it was interesting to me to look at 256 in relation to an Exeter suspect, in part because, number one, we had a revolver that was stolen and identified, and we had this other set of loot that was down here, and that had a clear raincoat, some ammo that was identified for the ransacker, plus a 1-inch screwdriver that happened to match the pry marks for several of the burglaries. So it was determined that this was ransacker burglary tool, this was gun stolen ransacker loot. So, you know, it's a long way away from the crimes, but it points towards someone who was going this direction rather than going there. So I do know that there was one more important point as pertains to the Clifton case. Clifton had been away from the area for a number of years, but had recently moved back. And if you look at the telephone directories for Tulare County for 1975, and you happened to want to know where Oscar Clifton lived, you would have found one address, and that's for his parents who lived on Hypericum. The loot here is quite literally across the street from Hypericum. It appeared to me, if the theory of framing was correct, that we had one piece of loot right there on practically at the driveway, and the other here. Looking at the images of those where they are now, this is the location where the gun was recovered, and here is where the raincoat and ammo were recovered. And if you right quite literally across the street, there is Hypericum Avenue. So that caught my attention. I noticed too that the suspect list had included a lot of the fertilizer company employees. There were some additional searches that were done around the area. No other loot was ever discovered. But one of the questions for John then was, you know, were there any other stashes of loot that were hidden? How was this Exeter lead investigated, or was it not investigated? And would this be a possible clue to point to, again, affirm some of this information that suggested Exeter? So the revolver, what do you remember about that?
I remember finding it. It was a Taurus 4-inch revolver stolen in a ransack burglary.
Did it have a
I'd
serial
say
number?
A month or two before.
I think it was about a week after Snelling, and the gun itself was taken from a burglary on Mountain, I believe in May. So it had been out in that location for some time, or possibly, you know, planted there later. We don't know exactly, but we know when it was discovered, and the water levels had dropped down, and because of the timing, the citizen contacted Visalia Police Department, not the Sheriff's Department. He thought perhaps that the gun was related to Snelling's, which is why he reached out to Visalia PD. Do you remember if it had a serial number?
You're not going to ask me that number, are you?
No, I'm not going to ask you the number itself.
Yeah, I remember the number was in
Yeah.
the report, and that's
Yeah.
the gun, yeah.
That is an interesting point, because one of the things that we know about a lot of the other weapons that DeAngelo stole is that he favored keeping guns in his possession or reusing them if they did not have a serial number. So if they were foreign manufacturer, or if they were pre-1968 weapons, he would keep those. If they had a serial number, they could be traced. So we know
He
this
preferred the 38 caliber, which
this is also true.
now we know is law enforcement.
This is also true. So it was those locations, it was those distances, and it was the proximity to Hypericum that definitely caught my attention to say, if this is, again, part of all of this, the combination of the loot, the armor, abduction, location, the required familiarity with her scene, all of those things, and the proximity then to Richmond, everything seemed, in my mind, to say, let's look for a suspect in Exeter. So in addition to that, I think one of the other things that caught my attention was something I pointed out to John at our first meeting. I said, you know, it seemed to me, when I was looking at your reports, on each particular night, the way this guy would operate, he would only hit in one zone. He would hit in zone 1 only. He would hit in zone 2 only. It's as if he knew the patrol schedule. And so I have a question for you. Was this the orientation of your patrol map in 1975? Was this what you were using? And the answer was yes. This was the patrol. I found a patrol map. I think it was from maybe 1980, but I wanted to confirm that it was the same in 1975, and this turned out to be true. And as a matter of fact, the other pattern about that was that only on 2 occasions do we know now that he crossed between, for instance, between Route 2 and 3. But I went through and looked at each of the maps, and I looked, for instance, some of these nights he would hit 4 or 5 times a night. So I would say, what was the best sequence? How would you get from home 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5? What route would you take? And to draw a line literally on the map between those events. Then look at the next sequence and then see how many times those lines crossed each other. And say, you know, what are the proximities? What are the locations that we're looking for? And it turns out that we see in doing that pattern revealed that some of the more sexualized burglaries in the series appear to be his targeted victims, where he was also involved in peeping in on these young girls. And many of them were the cheerleaders at Mount Whitney. So he had this repeated pattern of this string that inevitably led him through and around over the same night, connecting these victims' homes. That was the other thing that I discovered. So those things in tangent, but I'm going to say there was one other point about the Ransacker series that just utterly had my laser focus. And that was a quote that John had given Sacramento when he had gone up there to say, what were the similarities? He'd given a press interview and said, what were the similarities between your suspect and the Visalia ransacker? And one of the things that John had identified as the most unique MO point was a sentence where he said it was the peculiarity of taking things from one home and leaving them in another. In other words, he was taking items, often jewelry or small personal possessions, from one home and planting them in another. And in so doing, we're identifying one of the key attributes, not a method of operation point, because it wasn't required for the element of the crime. You don't need to do that, but it is what we call a signature. It is something that you are, as an offender, doing to make it clear either to yourself or to law enforcement who might be investigating it, you're leaving a particular clue. You're leaving a signature. This is me. And reading through those reports and identifying that trait that you had picked up on in Visalia and seeing that as the possible explanation for how Oscar Clifton's invoice book ended up in Exeter next to the bicycle was a possible explanation for that piece of evidence. The other thing that we talked about that time was about the possibility, given the familiarity with the zones, was your suspect someone that you were looking at? Were they possibly in law enforcement? And if you go through the suspect list, as I've done many times, you'll find a broad array of individuals who are on that suspect list. You'll find people from all kinds of professional backgrounds. You'll find people who are career criminals. You'll find people who had no familiarity with the area, and some had very strong familiarity with the area. In other words, the people who were considered as suspects were there for legitimate criminalistic reasons. They were known associates, they lived in the area, they had priors, there were reasons to be there. But in and among that long list of names, there were probably a dozen different police officers who were considered as suspects. And as you mentioned last time, the individual that had been turned in most regularly on the tip line was one of the Visalia police officers. He was eliminated, but I think one of the things then that became clear was that whoever this offender was, at a minimum, had operational knowledge. And the other important point to bring in here is that despite all of the hundreds of items that were stolen in Visalia in the graph that I showed earlier, not once did any of those items ever show up in a pawn shop or at a fence. They weren't identified by the burglary crew. They weren't picked up later on. None of these items were among those things. That suggested either that the person was very lucky or stole unique fetish items only, which was still a very strong possibility, or three, that the person knew how the system worked, that they knew that they would not steal serialized items, they would not steal engraved items, they would not steal anything that would potentially be identified. That is another indication of law enforcement. Knowledge, not necessarily that it is law enforcement, but how those crimes are solved tells you a lot about, and what the actions are of the offender tells you a lot about who this person was. And that, to me, told me a lot. You never had any of the items show up in CII or at a pawn shop or anything else.
Nope.
Not once. So that was really important to me.
Tony, can I interrupt one second?
Yes, you may.
We are getting close to running, I mean, we've got so much material we can cover. Is there
Let's-
anything you want?
Let me answer.
Yeah, let's do this.
I'll say yes or no.
Let's get John's question here.
Okay,
I'm going to skip over some of the questions that I had identified after because they're going to take too long to explain. I agree, but I do want John's opinion on this before we dive over to the video. I have one quick video that I'm hoping everybody can see, and I think it will explain a lot to you. And I don't believe you've seen this before, but tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the ransacker burglary items.
Well, before I do that, I'd like to tell you about the book. The first time we met here, it was Terry wanted you to know things that you didn't know. He wanted us, or me, to explain how we did this. It isn't news, isn't publicized, and we gave you a lot of information that you probably didn't hear before. Well, I will tell you this, the book is that way too. You'll read things in that book that no one else knows. It's not out in the public for people to see. It's in this book. And I will tell you before I answer that other question, there's a mystery to me in this book that just has me fascinated. And that is Oscar Clifton's attorney died the night before he was to testify in his appeal hearing. And he was an attorney in Visalia that I knew for years. And he was a good attorney, I thought. And he went to a bar association meeting in Tulare that night. And after the meeting, instead of coming back to Visalia, he went west out into the wastelands south of Corcoran Prison in the boonies and was found dead the next day. That is a whole mystery. It could be part 2 of this book. That really has fascinated me. This attorney died at that approximate pinpoint of time. It's amazing to me.
It makes literally no sense. I wish I had enough time to go into that because it is an utterly fascinating chapter. There are so many stories in the case, but that's definitely one of them.
To answer his question now, before you get going, remember that all the items he took were not valuable items. They weren't monetary value. There was no hundreds of dollars taken. There was no expensive jewelry taken. To me, it was all keepsakes, which I still think he has in the storage unit somewhere that he's not talking about. And I hope someday some guy in a storage company will think, wow, that guy hasn't, or he'll actually still pay for it. I don't know if it's still being paid for. But I think he's kept on it. He didn't do this.
Trophy items, huh?
Yeah, he didn't do this for the value of the property. He did it for sexual deviations that he had. Okay.
Yeah, we agree on that. All right, so we're going to dim the lights in the room, and we're going to watch a quick video.
In my experience, the
I'm
rapist,
not gonna watch it.
John's not going to watch it, but we are.
talking about usually does not have a prior criminal
A
record.
little more volume.
He's very often the clean-cut young man next door, the college boy type, the storybook type of rapist that, you know, that is pictured in the movies and so on. Doesn't usually exist.
Just want to get the guy looking at it.
We put out enough composites on this thing already, different height.
Mike Boyd, KCRA News.
This does not fit the description of the East Area Rapist at all.
Not only that, their foot size is different. These types of statements being made by these officers in Visalia are unprofessional, irresponsible. It can have, they're basing their theory on speculation.
It would be an understatement to say that the Sheriff's Department isn't upset about the alleged statement made by the Visalia Police about the investigation of the East Area Rapist situation. However, we were unable to get a hold of city police officials to find out exactly what they thought about those alleged statements. I'm Chet Hancock for Action News 13.
The mask from the Richmond case was ordered destroyed within a year of Clifton's conviction, along with most of the evidence from the case, as ordered by the lead investigator, Bob Bird, who arrested Clifton in '65 and in '75, and who knew Clifton from before.
All of his behavior indicates that he was trying to hide something. How much? That's a question that only he can answer.
He did answer by denying what multiple records and testimony show.
I understand from some records that a lot of the evidence was destroyed less than a year after the trial ended, and that it was authorized by you, the destruction of this evidence. Can you tell me why that was?
Well, it wasn't done. I would never ordered any evidence in any case ever destroyed.
Okay.
Wouldn't do that. It wouldn't do that in a murder case because a murder case is always subject to be tried again as long as the person's alive. So if you want to destroy your evidence, that'd be idiotic.
Is it normal that they would destroy all this evidence right after
I wouldn't have done
trial?
it. So that's not how we do it today.
Was it common practice then to destroy evidence
I don't
right
know.
after the trial?
I have no idea.
Clifton was facing death. Destroying evidence which could have been essential to his appeal is illegal now and was illegal then. We don't know if he knew Bird or any of the detectives investigating the Donna Jo Richmond murder, but we do know Bird went to work on the case that night at the Exeter police station where DeAngelo worked. We also know from property records and other neighbors' accounts that Joseph James DeAngelo was neighbors with Bob Bird.
So this is DeAngelo's house?
Correct.
And what you're saying is
We
there's
go
one,
2 houses down.
2,
Yep.
and this third house.
Correct. Yeah.
Do you remember a man by the name of Joseph James DeAngelo, the man who now is suspected to be the Golden State Killer?
I never heard of him till I heard it on the news.
Okay, so you don't remember him from living about 2 houses down from where you lived at the time on Peach Street?
Never lived down from me.
Okay, you don't remember him then. I understand.
I don't remember ever seeing him. Maybe though I lived in Exeter, I never knew him.
Did you have any doubts when they caught him, due to the nature of the case, that perhaps he was the one who could have killed Donna Jo?
No, I haven't. I don't think he had anything to do with it. The evidence didn't point that way.
He's the most prolific serial killer rapist in the history of California, for sure. And it didn't have to happen. I mean, he should have been caught.
In that video, there were 2 clips that started out there at the beginning. Those both come from the Center for Sacramento History. The first was a series of reports from KCRA Mike Boyd, and then we had the clip from KVOR, which was in May of 1978. The segment that started there had Ray Root and a little clip of Richard Shelby, and then we, of course, had the PIO for Sacramento talking about the Ransacker connection. The final half of this, the next segment, if you will, was from ABC 10's Framed by the Golden State Killer. That was reporter Lilia Luciano and producer Mike Bonnell. And of course, that particular segment, I focused the material on the other investigator, the Tulare County Sheriff's Sergeant, who was the lead investigator on the Richmond case, Bob Bird. You heard it in his own words, denying that he had anything to do with the destruction of that evidence. It was his signature on that order, on February 28th, 1977. And I want you to contemplate for just a moment if you had been convicted of a crime and were told repeatedly by your trial counsel that the attorney and the courts would save all of this evidence, and if should you get a new trial, this will be saved and it will be made available for a new trial. Clifton was on death row. He was given the death penalty for the crime, wrongly. Clifton was originally charged with rape and murder. 2 days before the grand jury was held in March of 1976, those charges were dropped and changed to attempted rape because the criminalists and the forensics proved there was no rape of Donna Jo Richmond. The charge was modified to attempted rape. When it got to trial, Ray Donahue should have told the court that attempted rape does not make the homicide considered as a capital crime. Only an affected rape can qualify as a capital case in California. So imagine sitting on death row 6 months after this sentence came down and not knowing, being in prison, not knowing that this evidence was ordered to be destroyed and would never be available for testing. That's what happened. That's what Bob Byrd did. He ordered the destruction of this evidence on February 28th, 1977, 6 months after that sentence came down. Clifton never had a fighting chance once that evidence was destroyed. He had the assistance of 2 officers. He had the assistance of the court, and he apparently had the assistance of the district attorney's office. That's pretty hard to swallow, but it's especially difficult when you then consider the other statements that you see Byrd making about his lack of knowledge of Joe DeAngelo. As I lay out in the book, I think I make a very solid case that Bob Byrd was one of the very first people to know about the East Area Rapist. On July 14th or 15th, I believe, of 1976, Tulare County Sheriffs had arrested a serial rapist operating in Porterville. He'd been there for the better part of 2 years. And when they heard about the MO points of the case, Sacramento called down to Porterville and asked to speak to the sheriff deputy in charge of that investigation, and that was Bob Byrd. And they told Bob that they wanted to put a hold on Benny Galloway, the suspect, because his MO so closely matched these 2 crimes that happened in Sacramento. The first was the June 18th attack, the first EAR attack, and the second being an early July attack. That was in July of 1976 when one of the first officers outside of Sacramento to learn about the series was Mr. Byrd. He personally was notified, and he is quoted in the Porterville Recorder as being the person who responded to this hold that Sacramento put on the case. He received in February of 1977, presumably right about the same time he ordered the destruction of the evidence, he received the first memo about the profile that was being developed of the rapist. That included the offender's blood type. There had been a scuffle at one of the rape attempts. there had been, the victim had managed to reach up and cut the offender with the knife, and he bled onto her. Because the criminalist was able to isolate her blood as a different blood type from the offender, they had for the first time the offender's blood type. That blood type is type A. That's what's in the report. When we go back and we look at the grand jury testimony and the forensics involved in the Richmond case, there was a blood type developed, and it was type A, and Clifton was an O. And that piece of information was not presented to the jury. There was no question about it. It's not there. We can see all of this information now. If you consider the fact that Byrd had an actual knowledge of the rapist operating in Sacramento, that he was a type A, he fit the type frame, and more importantly, we know that they were looking for someone possibly coming from Tulare County. I think that's one of the most disingenuous and offensive parts about what Sacramento's statements really ultimately were about, was the fact that they were looking at someone who possibly came from Tulare County. I don't know how else to process those words in that video from Bob Byrd. There is no explanation for any officer ever. And one of the first things when I talk about this case to any police officer, when I talk to John about the case the first time, the thing that put him on his heels was the destruction of the evidence. It should not have been done. It is illegal. And this is the reason why the courts are required to hold that evidence for a year after the person either dies in custody or is released from custody, a year after. Not from the conviction, but from the time they are out of race of the court. Words fail me now as to what all of that means.
I have a thing I'd like to throw in here is that during the trial and in 2019 when the district attorney re-looked at the case and said he felt Clifton was the suspect, they all referred to him as a registered sex offender. And I challenge anybody in this room to figure out how come he was a registered sex offender. He was not a registered sex offender. But that's still in their books. I just wanted to throw that out there.
When you think back about the other crimes that were going on and look at the cases, when we spoke, one of the questions I had for you was, so you must have, when you heard about the Richmond case, you must have thought that this could have been your explanation for Snelling. And
look at the date.
Right.
It was right after McGowan caught him.
Right.
So he was mad.
So the McGowan shooting happens in early December. And on the 18th of December, that's when the sketch comes out. And that has the composite, and it has the suspect description, and the now very notorious photograph. For those of you who, not including John, who looked up at the screen and saw Bill Miller's face, I noticed something funny the other day, and that was the odd similarity that Bill Miller has to the Visalia Ransacker sketch. You know, it's funny because people pick on that now and they say, well, how can you look at that sketch and not see Joe D'Angelo as being the suspect? Look out in the room, look out in the world. There's another person who looks very similar to that sketch, and that person's Gary Bardoni. Gary Bardoni is a dead ringer for that sketch. And when we look at what happened to Gary and the events at his home in late December, immediately after that sketch comes out, it's pretty significant. In my mind, you know, a lot of people look like that sketch. And the other thing I want to say, I think I've got it here. This is the copy that's off of the newspaper scan. This is not the microfilm copy. The microfilm copy is a lot clearer, like 100 times clearer. This is the image that I saw. This is that when I was starting to go through and develop a list of Exeter suspects. It's a much grainier, darker photo. I don't mean to make excuses for myself, but I had D'Angelo on the possible suspect list because he came onto the Exeter PD force. I was looking in Exeter, and he came onto the Exeter PD force in May of 1973. Had I seen a clearer photograph, that would have helped. Had I known that he came from Sacramento, that would also have helped. Had I known that he went to Auburn, that certainly would have sealed the deal. Didn't know those other things. Maybe if I had. I'm looking at this, and I remember the file date that I had on this, and it was January of 2017, so about a year and 3 months before his identification and arrest. We were almost there. We were really close. And the other thing that happened, I want to say, was in November of 2017, John agreed that we would go to Tulare County Sheriff's and plead with them to reopen the Armour investigation. And I drugged John. I said, this is the last time, John. I need your help one more time. And we went down there, and the meeting didn't last more than half an hour. It was really an exercise in frustration. It was difficult.
Waste of time, I guess.
Tony, do you want to see if we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, yes.
Do we have any?
So were there written questions that were collected? Thank you. Take just a moment here to allow me to read over your questions, and hopefully I can read your handwriting okay.
And again, he'll put the ones you can't respond to now, he'll put them on his Facebook page. Small spot.
Wanting to make sure I can read everybody's writing okay.
Do one more. That's a hard one.
Oh, brother.
For the sake of time, maybe 5 minutes or so, do you think?
This is a tough one. This is not one I can answer. How do I teach my grandkids to trust cops? You know, there are a lot of law enforcement officers in this story. There are some really fantastic ones. There's another one who's a serial killer. And there's a different one who I blame for all of the flaws in the Richmond investigation. I want to encourage you to read and reread the introduction to this book. It's only 10 pages long, but the problem of how law enforcement officers are selected, how they are supervised, how they are monitored for misconduct is a really important question. And until January of 2021, California did not have a decertification process for police officers. Even if you were convicted of a very serious crime, it might affect your ability to testify in court, but it wouldn't preclude you from being a law enforcement officer. And matter of fact, there are certain jurisdictions around California now who seem to prefer hiring police officers with a suspicious background. I don't know. This is a question for your mayor. This is a question for your police chief. This is what I was alluding to in my opening comments. We have to trust the justice system in our society. Things break down without our justice system. We need a better answer than the one I can give you. Do you have any thoughts, John? It's a really great question, and thank you for that. Was there a 7-Up bottle at any of the crime scenes that was prominently displayed? Did the ransacker take things from one scene to another? And why hasn't TCSO questioned DeAngelo, presumably as a suspect in the Armour homicide, if they've named him as a suspect? And this question comes from Rob Armour. Thank you for being here. We haven't met. We've spoken on the phone. I'd like to meet. What we do know, what I know from the Richmond case, is that there were 3 soda bottles, there were 3 beer bottles, and there were 2 liquor bottles that were at the Richmond homicide scene. Those items were taken into evidence. They were examined for fingerprints, and they were all wiped clean. That is consistent with the EAR crimes that we know about. We have reports in the EAR series of Dr. Pepper, liquor bottles. We have one from the Snelling, outside the Snelling house, another liquor bottle there that did not belong to the Snelling family, but it was found outside their residence. This is another signature element to his crimes. And it deals back to the whole issue of planting evidence, moving things, putting odd things next to the locations, putting odd things next to the scenes and the bodies and the victims, putting things immediately outside the home. That is a really great question. The last part of this question is, why has TCSO not questioned DeAngelo in that case after they've named him as a suspect? I don't know. I cannot get an answer to that question myself. I've asked many times. John has asked. What I do know is 2 things. One, DeAngelo is not talking to anyone. He has refused all press inquiries. He has refused all attorney inquiries, investigator inquiries. On the morning of the arrest, it is reported that he gave a very lengthy interview, 7 hours. And according to their own statements, this being Sacramento sheriffs, they cut off the interview because he was, quote, confessing to everything. We don't know from the plea proceedings how this case unfolded. We know that they presented the cases that were previously identified. Those were asked, those were answered, those were admitted. I would very much like to see that's the videotape of that 7-hour interview and see and hear if among those confessions there are other crimes. I have been told there are. But until we see either a transcript or the tape itself, we will not know. Again, he has refused all interviews, all inquiries, and at this point, unless someone decides to compel this jurisdiction to go ask about this crime, which the DA says now he is a suspect. DeAngelo was identified as a suspect in the Armour homicide in July of 2018. And after that moment, there has been nothing but deafening silence. Zero. It was not asked to be admitted. There was no inquiry. And the only answer from the DA's office is they said they did not get a referral from the sheriff's office. I'm flabbergasted. I can't explain this myself. I'm offended by what I've heard. Last week it was announced that there was DNA that resolved the Angelica Ramirez homicide. If you heard DA Ward's presentation earlier this year concerning the DNA and the Golden State Killer, he did 2 presentations, one at Tulare County Library and one at Visalia. He is heard on this tape admitting to the fact that DeAngelo is a suspect in the Armour homicide. And that he added to that list, he's also a suspect in Ramirez. Now that the Ramirez case is resolved, that leaves one. That makes your job a lot easier when you only have one. A related question, did anyone ever ask DeAngelo about the Richmond homicide? Same answer. Whatever happened to the evidence of the plaster of Paris footprint taken at the scene? It was said it was never taken, then said it was. It was said to be inadmissible. This is from a Clifton family member. The investigation into the Richmond homicide is so deeply flawed that words begin to fail me as I try to put this into a short, comprehensible answer. The officers at the scene responded to the homicide location at 1:30 p.m. and they released that scene at 5:30. They did 4 hours of field work at the homicide location. They took, as was described, they took plaster casts of the various locations. They took approximately 20 to 25 photographs of the various foot tracks and tire tracks at that location. It was revealed after the trial by Jay Powell himself in a comment to the Exeter Sun, where he is recorded saying, the camera used in the Richmond case was defective. It was taking blurry, unfocused images. The plaster casts that we know were taken at Road 176 were not introduced into evidence. There are reports of additional plaster casts being taken at the bicycle location near the Richmond home that were not introduced into evidence. Everything of significant value that pointed away from Oscar Clifton was not admitted as evidence. That is what we call exculpatory information. That is what we call pointing to the likely involvement, participation, culpability of a different person. The officers at the scene described the tracks and footprints at the bicycle scene as having been so compromised by a large law enforcement response that they decided not to take anything. That is not how you collect tire track and foot track information. When you have a compromised scene, you collect everything. You still collect every track possible. You then go back and eliminate each source. This one came from Jim. This one came from Tom. This came from Sally. We know what each of these were. That's not how they ran the scene. They released the bicycle scene within 6 hours from the time they arrived. That's not how you conduct an investigation.
Tony, I think we're going to probably have to
All right.
call it quits. I'm going to give each of you a chance to make a final argument or a final statement before we adjourn to do the book signing.
All I've got left is I wish I knew who was present when D'Angelo confessed. Was it just Sacramento County Sheriff's Office? If it was, they won't tell anybody anything. I'd like to know who was there because I heard that he confessed to Vice Mayor Ransacker and Sonali homicide.
The morning of. I was contacted by a reporter on the morning of the arrest who had been in contact with me during my investigation. And she said, "You're not going to believe this. They arrested an Auburn police officer for the crimes." And I said, "You're not going to believe this because when I saw the name, I knew I'd seen it before." He wasn't just an Auburn PD officer. He was an Exeter PD officer. What are you talking about? This guy was in Auburn from May of 1973 to August of 1976. I want to point out just quickly, that means he was with Exeter PD for the first 3 EAR attacks. He was still in Exeter when those happened. Post-panel remarks. I know that hearing from a defense investigator and someone who helps represent criminal defendants is not always welcome. When I start talking, not everyone wants to listen. I want to clarify one thing. Criminal defense is not about the defendants. It is not about that person. It's about the Constitution. It's about due process. It's about equal protection. It's your rights, or your brother, your sister, your cousin, your friend, or your neighbor. Anyone who is accused of a crime deserves the proper time, care, and attention when they're accused. Criminal defense is about evidence. It's the ability to distinguish things that are mere theory and speculation from proper items of evidence, and from those to draw legitimate facts and conclusions. As much as nature abhors a vacuum, true crime abhors an unsolved crime. When the system doesn't provide quick and easy answers, that hole still gets filled. The problem is armchair detectives, citizen sleuthing, or crowdsourcing an investigation have created a terrible disaster for the true crime world. No better example can be found than in this story. The 40-year failed legacy of the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, and the conviction of Oscar Clifton. There is a very solid reason why my book is nearly half quotes and source material. It's boring. It's tedious. It's legal. It's the only thing that truly matters. My analysis, the way I put things together for you to understand and presenting one idea before the other shouldn't change your mind. But the facts and the evidence must. I also want to say that I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to write the book. I didn't want to step out in front. I love staying behind the scenes. I told the publisher that if it were possible let's try to do this anonymous, and they rejected the idea. I have only 2 rules for my work. Do good work and let the evidence speak for itself. And it was actually Richard Shelby, of all people in this case, with whom I'd been in steady communication since 2016, who urged me to write the book and step forward and do this. And yeah, I've given lots of interviews, I've spoken on camera, I've done newspaper articles, etc. I've participated in writing the appeals to the Attorney General's office and to the local DA's office. That involvement changed in writing this book, and the process changed. A book really is different. It's the physical manifestation. You can hold it in your hands, you can look up the sources, you can ask a question, you can flip back through, how did I get here? When you're done with it, you can hand it to a friend or a family member, and I encourage you to do that. You can get mad at this book. You can embrace it. Whatever you feel about it, the book process requires a face to step forward. That's why I'm here. Thank you for coming.
Folks, this is Tulare County Visalia history at its best right here, and we've had a chance to hear from the best. So again, give them one more round of applause, please. Okay, now what's going to happen is that we're going to adjourn, we're going to rise, and we're going to move to the lobby for refreshments. And as you continue out the door, there'll be 2 lines, one to buy books and one to have those books signed and autographed by either one or both of these gentlemen here. So this is the time to stand up, stretch, and head out to the door, please. Yeah, thank you, Brent.
We were all saying the exact same thing. I said, I've got to get out of here.
Tim, I'm sorry, what did you say? I know, but I knew it was Tim.